There is a very specific moment in the awakening process that almost no one explains clearly. It is not the moment of big revelations. It is not when everything suddenly feels magical or enlightened. And it is not even the first moment when you begin to suspect that reality might be different from what you always believed. This moment comes right after. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed at first. But by the time you realize it is happening, something inside you has already changed. It is the moment when awareness begins to expand, and suddenly you start looking at the world around you in a completely different way. The same streets, the same conversations, the same routines, the same people. Everything appears exactly the same. And yet, at the same time, something feels entirely different. Maybe you have experienced this before. Maybe you have found yourself sitting in a conversation with friends, family members, or colleagues, and suddenly realizing that the way you are hearing the conversation is no longer the same. Words that once sounded normal now feel strangely superficial. Topics that once felt important now seem empty. And interactions that once felt natural start to feel disconnected. Not because the people around you have changed, but because the way you perceive reality has begun to shift. And at this point, many people begin to feel something difficult to describe. A quiet sense of distance. It is not necessarily sadness. It is not rejection. And it is not simply the desire to withdraw from others. It is something subtler. It feels as if part of you has begun to perceive reality from a different frequency, while the rest of the world continues operating exactly as it always has. And this can lead to a question many people ask themselves in silence. Why do I feel different from the people around me? Or perhaps an even deeper question, why does it feel like I am alone in this process? This is one of the most common experiences during conscious awakening, but it is also one of the least understood, because when this phase begins, many people assume something is wrong with them. They begin to wonder if they are isolating themselves, or if they are becoming harder for others to understand. Some even question whether they are overthinking things, or distancing themselves from life. But what almost no one explains is that this feeling of loneliness can be a natural consequence of a profound internal transformation. When awareness begins to expand, it does not only change the way you think, it changes the way you observe. It changes the way you interpret human interactions. It changes the way you perceive behavior. And slowly, you begin to notice patterns that once went completely unnoticed. You start seeing how many conversations follow repetitive loops. How many relationships are built on invisible expectations? How many people live within automatic patterns of behavior, without even realizing it? And when you begin to see these things more clearly, something curious happens. You are still living in the same world, but it begins to feel as if you are observing everything from a slightly different place, as if a new layer of perception has opened, and this can create a very particular feeling, a feeling that many people describe as loneliness. But perhaps that word does not fully capture what is happening, because this phase does not necessarily mean you are losing connection with others. In many cases, it means you are beginning to perceive human connection at a much deeper level. However, this new perception often requires a period of adjustment, a period where your inner world begins reorganizing how you relate to reality. And during this process, it is common to feel a certain distance between the way you see life and the way many people around you still see it. At first, this distance may feel uncomfortable. It may even feel as if you are walking alone. But what very few people realize is that this phase may actually be one of the most important stages of the entire awakening journey, because it is precisely within this space of silence, this space of observation, that something deeply transformative begins to unfold within the mind. A transformation that slowly changes how you understand yourself, and how you relate to the world. But to truly understand why this feeling of loneliness appears during awakening, we must first explore something fundamental. We must understand what actually happens inside the mind when awareness begins to expand. Because awakening does not only change what you think, it changes the way you perceive reality itself. And when this shift begins, many internal structures that once felt solid start to reorganize. And it is exactly at this point that many people begin to realize that something inside them is no longer the same. But this transformation does not happen suddenly. It unfolds slowly, silently, and often, almost invisibly to the outside world. Yet for the person experiencing it, it can feel incredibly profound, and that is exactly what we are going to explore next. When this feeling begins to appear for the first time, many people cannot immediately understand what is happening. They simply notice that something has changed. Something inside them has started observing life in a different way. At first, this shift can feel extremely subtle. It is not as if a light suddenly turns on. It is not as if all the answers suddenly appear. In fact, The opposite often happens. The more awareness begins to expand, the more questions begin to appear. Questions that never existed before. Questions that may have never crossed your mind. For example, you may start noticing that many conversations seem to follow the same patterns, the same complaints, the same worries, the same stories repeated over and over again. And suddenly you might begin asking yourself, are people truly listening to each other? Or are they simply waiting for their turn to speak? This is a realization that many people experience during awakening. Because when awareness begins to expand, you start observing not only what people say, but how they say it. You begin to notice the tone, the pauses, the automatic reactions, the predictable responses, and slowly something interesting begins to happen. You begin to see how much of human interaction happens on autopilot. People repeating emotional patterns, reacting to situations in ways that have become unconscious habits, recreating the same conflicts, reliving the same frustrations, often without even realizing it. In the past, you may have been completely immersed in these patterns as well. But now something has shifted. Now there is a part of you that observes, a part that notices, a part that begins to see what is happening beneath the surface of interactions. And this new way of perceiving the world can be deeply transformative, but it can also create an unexpected feeling because the more clearly you begin to see these patterns, the harder it becomes to simply ignore them. Before, certain conversations felt natural. Now they may feel repetitive. Before, certain behaviors felt normal. Now they may feel predictable. Before, certain social dynamics felt natural. Now they may feel mechanical. And this can create a strange sensation, not because you feel superior to others, but because you begin to notice how much of human interaction happens without real awareness. And when this realization begins to emerge, something very interesting happens within the mind. You begin to pause before reacting. You begin to observe before responding. You begin to reflect before becoming emotionally involved. And this small pause changes everything, because that pause creates space between stimulus and reaction, a space many people never experience. And inside that space, something new begins to emerge. Clarity, observation, awareness. However, there is an interesting side effect to this process. The more conscious you become, the more you begin to notice how many people around you are still operating within automatic patterns. And this can create a sense of distance. Not because you want to withdraw, but because you begin to realize how differently people can perceive the same reality. It is as if two people are looking at the same situation, but seeing completely different worlds. One person sees only the events. The other begins to see the patterns behind the events. One person reacts automatically. The other begins to observe before reacting. One person lives inside the story. The other begins to see the structure of the story. And when this shift in perception begins to unfold, many people experience a moment of inner confusion. They start wondering if they are changing too much, if they are distancing themselves from others, if they are disconnecting from life. But what many people fail to realize is that this phase of observation is a fundamental part of awakening. Because awakening does not mean stepping away from reality. It means seeing reality more clearly. It means noticing things that once went completely unnoticed. It means recognizing invisible patterns. It means understanding emotional dynamics. It means seeing how the mind itself operates. And as this clarity begins to emerge, many internal structures start reorganizing. Things that once seemed important begin losing their meaning. Things that once felt urgent begin to feel superficial. Things that once felt normal begin to feel strange. And it is exactly at this stage that many people begin to experience what we call the loneliness of awakening. But perhaps this loneliness is not exactly what it appears to be. Perhaps it is not disconnection. Perhaps it is simply space. A space where the mind begins to reorganize. A space where new ways of perceiving reality begin to emerge. A space where awareness begins stabilizing at a new level of perception. But to truly understand why this space can initially feel lonely, we need to explore something even deeper. We need to understand how awakening begins transforming the way you relate to the people around you, because this is where the transformation starts becoming visible, and often this is where the journey becomes even more intense. There comes a very particular moment in this process when you begin to realize that the change is not only happening inside you, something broader begins to unfold. Your way of perceiving human relationships starts to transform. This is the stage where many people begin to notice something that can feel deeply unsettling. They realize that some relationships start to shift. Not necessarily because there was conflict, not necessarily because someone consciously chose to step away, but simply because the way reality is being perceived is no longer the same. Perhaps you have experienced this yourself. Maybe you notice that certain conversations that once felt natural now feel difficult to sustain. Topics that once flowed easily now feel forced. Interactions that once felt light now seem strangely empty. And this can create a confusing feeling, because at the same time that you still care about the people in your life, you begin to notice that something in the dynamic of the relationship has changed. Sometimes this change is almost imperceptible. A slightly longer silence during a conversation, a subtle sense of disconnection, a quiet feeling that certain interactions no longer carry the same depth, and this can lead many people to ask a difficult question. Am I drifting away from people? But perhaps that question is not entirely accurate, because in many cases what is happening is not distance, it is transformation. When awareness begins to expand, something interesting occurs within the mind. You begin to value certain types of interactions differently. Superficial conversations may start to feel exhausting. Repetitive discussions may start to feel unnecessary. Social dynamics based on competition, comparison, or approval begin to lose meaning, and slowly, something new begins to emerge. A deeper desire for authenticity, a deeper appreciation for silence, a deeper longing for conversations that carry presence and sincerity. However, there is an important detail in this process. While you begin to perceive these shifts, many of the people around you continue living exactly as they always have. And this can create a subtle sense of misalignment, not because anyone is right or wrong, but because perception begins evolving at different speeds. Imagine two people walking together along a road. For a long time they move at the same pace, but at a certain moment one of them slows down to observe the path more carefully, while the other continues walking at the same pace as before. Suddenly a small distance appears between them, not because one wanted to leave, but because their rhythms changed. Something very similar can happen during awakening. When perception shifts, the inner rhythm shifts. The way you react changes. The way you engage emotionally changes. And often, the way you connect with people changes as well. This may create moments of silence in relationships, moments where you observe more than you speak, moments where you realize you do not need to respond to everything, moments where you see that not every interaction needs to be sustained. For some people these moments may feel uncomfortable, but for someone going through awakening, these moments begin revealing something deeper. They reveal that awareness is stabilizing in a new place, a place where automatic reaction begins giving way to observation, a place where the need for approval begins losing its grip, a place where silence begins to carry a different meaning. And when this shift occurs, relationships naturally begin reorganizing. Some become deeper, some simply lose intensity, others quietly fade away. And although this may feel painful at first, something important is happening in this process. Because when certain connections dissolve, space begins to open for new forms of connection. Connections based on presence, connections based on authenticity, connections based on awareness. But before these new connections appear, many people experience a period of transition, a period where the old no longer feels aligned, and the new has not yet fully arrived. And it is exactly in this space of transition that many people experience what we call the loneliness of awakening. But perhaps this loneliness is not emptiness. Perhaps it is simply the silence required for something new to emerge within consciousness. And to understand why this silence is so important, we need to look at something even deeper. We need to explore what happens to identity itself when awakening begins to deepen, because often, what is changing is not only your relationships, what is changing is the very way you perceive who you are. There comes a point in the awakening process where something even deeper begins to unfold. Up until now, you may have noticed changes in conversations, changes in relationships, changes in the way you observe the world. But there is another layer to this transformation, a deeper layer that often goes unnoticed at first. Because it does not only affect the way you see others, it begins to transform the way you see yourself. For most of our lives, we build a certain idea of who we are, an identity, an internal narrative, a story about ourselves. This story may have been built through years of experiences, through the expectations of others, through the roles we learned to play. And without realizing it, that narrative slowly becomes something solid within the mind. You begin to identify with certain traits, certain roles, certain ways of reacting to life. Perhaps you came to see yourself as someone outgoing, or perhaps as someone quiet and reflective, maybe as someone who always needs to please others, or someone who constantly needs to prove their value. These identities become reinforced over time, and gradually they begin to feel permanent, definitive, as if they define exactly who you are. But when awakening deepens, something interesting begins to happen. Awareness starts observing the identity itself. And when awareness observes something, space appears. Suddenly you begin to notice that many of the traits you believed were you may simply be patterns, learned patterns, repeated patterns, patterns shaped over years of experience. You may begin to notice that reactions that once felt natural were actually emotional habits. You may realize that behaviors you thought were part of your personality were simply conditioned responses. And this realization can be deeply liberating. But it can also feel unsettling, because when we begin observing our identity, something important begins to shift. It becomes less rigid, less fixed, more fluid. And this is the stage where many people experience something very particular. They begin to feel as if the old version of themselves is slowly dissolving. Things that once felt like part of their personality begin to lose intensity. Reactions that once felt automatic begin to soften. Emotional needs that once felt urgent begin to fade. And this can create a strange sensation, because the human mind is used to holding on to identities. It likes to know who it is. It prefers clear definitions. But when awakening deepens, those definitions begin to soften, and this can lead to moments of deep inner silence. Moments where you begin asking yourself, if I am no longer exactly the person I thought I was, then who am I? At first, this question can feel uncomfortable, but it can also open a powerful doorway, because when identity becomes more flexible, something new begins to appear. A different kind of presence, a way of being that does not depend so heavily on fixed roles, a way of experiencing yourself with greater openness. And when this transformation begins, something interesting also happens in your relationships. The people around you may sense that something has changed. They may not know exactly what has changed, but they notice that your reactions are different, that things that once affected you deeply now seem lighter, that situations that once created conflict now feel calmer, and this may create different reactions in others. Some may feel curious, some may feel confused, and some may feel that the dynamic of the relationship has shifted. But what is truly happening in that moment is something much deeper. Awareness is beginning to stabilize beyond identity. And when that happens, the way you experience life begins to transform. You react less automatically. You observe more deeply. You begin realizing that many things that once felt urgent no longer require so much energy. And slowly, something many people describe as a different kind of peace begins to appear. A peace that does not depend on external circumstances. A peace that arises from a new relationship with the mind itself. But this peace does not appear suddenly. It emerges gradually, often beginning as silence, a kind of inner stillness that may feel unfamiliar at first. But within that silence, something important begins to reorganize, because within that silence, consciousness begins to stabilize in a new way. And this is where many people begin realizing that awakening is not simply a change in thinking. It is a transformation in the way awareness experiences itself. And that transformation changes everything. But to fully understand what happens next, we need to explore something even deeper. We need to look at what occurs when this new awareness begins integrating into everyday life, because that is where something unexpected begins to appear. Something many people describe as a strange peace, a quiet peace, a peace that emerges when the mind finally stops fighting reality. As this phase of loneliness becomes clearer, something interesting begins to happen inside the mind. At first, many people interpret this experience as a form of loss, a loss of connection, a loss of closeness, a loss of something that once felt like a natural part of life. But over time, a different realization begins to emerge. The realization that perhaps this phase is not truly a form of separation. Perhaps it is simply space. A space that appears when certain internal structures begin to reorganize. For most of our lives, we learn to interact with the world through automatic patterns. Patterns of reaction, patterns of expectation, patterns of social behavior that we repeat without even noticing. These patterns create familiarity. They make interactions feel natural. They keep relationships operating within predictable dynamics. But when awareness begins to awaken, something starts shifting within those patterns. Suddenly, certain automatic responses stop happening. Certain emotional reactions lose their intensity. Certain social behaviors begin to feel unnecessary, and this shift creates something very interesting. It creates silence. Silence in interactions, silence in reactions, silence within the mind itself. At first, this silence may feel unfamiliar, because the human mind is used to constant movement. It is used to reacting, commenting, explaining, positioning itself in every interaction. But when awakening deepens, that movement begins to slow down. And within that slowing down, something many people have never experienced before begins to appear. The ability to simply observe. To observe without reacting immediately. to observe without judging, to observe without turning every experience into a mental story. This kind of observation creates a profound space within consciousness, a space where the mind begins reorganizing itself. And within that space something surprising begins to appear. The loneliness that once felt heavy begins transforming into silence, and that silence begins revealing something important. It reveals that many of the connections we maintained in the past were sustained by automatic patterns, by unconscious expectations, by social dynamics that functioned more through habit than through genuine presence. When those patterns begin dissolving, relationships naturally transform. Some become more authentic, some become deeper, and others simply fade away. Not because someone decided to end them, but because the pattern that sustained the connection no longer exists. And although this can feel difficult at first, something very interesting begins to unfold within that space. Awareness becomes more stable, more calm, more quiet. You begin realizing that not every moment needs to be filled with interaction, that not every expectation needs to be answered, that not every social dynamic needs to be maintained. And this realization can bring an unexpected feeling, a feeling of freedom, because when the mind stops reacting automatically, something new begins to emerge. Presence, a clearer presence, a calmer presence, a presence that is less dependent on external circumstances. And gradually you begin to see that the loneliness of awakening may not actually be loneliness. Perhaps it is simply a period of recalibration within consciousness, a phase where the mind releases old patterns, a phase where new forms of connection slowly begin to appear. But before those new connections emerge, awareness must pass through a space of silence, and this silence may feel empty at first, but in reality it is filled with something essential, clarity, because when the noise of automatic reactions fades, something deeper begins to reveal itself. You begin to notice that many of the tensions in life were connected to the constant need to adjust yourself to the environment, to meet expectations, to react to emotional stimuli around you. But when that need begins to dissolve, something new starts appearing, a different way of being in the world, quieter, more present, more aware. And when this presence begins stabilizing, something unexpected begins to emerge, something many people describe as a strange peace, a peace that does not depend on circumstances, a peace that arises when the mind finally stops fighting reality. And that peace may feel unusual at first, because it does not come from gaining something, it comes from the disappearance of certain internal conflicts. But to fully understand that peace, we must look at what happens when the mind finally learns to stop resisting the experience of life itself, because that is exactly where something deeply transformative begins to unfold. If you made it this far into the video, perhaps something inside you recognized something that has always been there. Maybe some of the reflections we explored touched parts of your own experience. Maybe you remembered moments in your life when you began seeing the world differently, moments when certain conversations started feeling empty, moments when certain environments began feeling strange, moments when you started noticing thoughts, observing your own thoughts, as if, for the first time, something inside you was looking at the mind from the outside. And when that begins to happen, something profound starts to change. Because for most of our lives, we believe we are exactly what the mind says we are. We believe the stories, the labels, the narratives that have been built over the years. I am this kind of person. I've always been this way. This is just who I am. But awakening begins to reveal something very different. It begins to show that many of those certainties were simply mental constructions, identities formed through experiences, inherited beliefs, social expectations, roles we learn to perform. And when this realization begins to appear, something interesting happens. The mind slowly begins to lose some of its authority. You begin to notice that thoughts appear, but you are not exactly those thoughts. You begin to notice that emotions arise, but they also pass. You begin to realize that many of the stories that once defined your identity were simply stories. And this realization can bring an unexpected feeling, a silence, an inner space, a kind of calm that does not depend so much on external circumstances. But at the same time, this process can create a strange sensation, because when the mind begins losing its old certainties, an inevitable question appears. If I am not the stories I used to tell about myself, then who am I? And this question becomes one of the deepest doors of awareness, because when it appears sincerely, it begins dissolving many old structures. This is the moment when many people realize they are going through something much deeper than just personal change. They begin to see that their entire identity is transforming. This can bring moments of clarity, but also moments of confusion, moments when it feels like some internal reference points are disappearing, Moments when what once felt solid begins to feel fluid, as if the structure of the mind itself is slowly reorganizing, and that can feel uncomfortable because the human ego was designed to create a sense of stability, a narrative about who we are, an image of identity, a psychological character we learn to sustain in the world. But when awakening deepens, something begins happening to that character. It begins losing strength. Old stories stop making sense. Old motivations begin changing. Old desires begin feeling different. And this is where many people start experiencing something very intense. The feeling that the old self is disappearing, as if an older version of identity is slowly dissolving. This can create fear, resistance, the sense that something is wrong, but perhaps nothing is wrong. Perhaps this is simply the natural process of awareness awakening. Because when the mind stops sustaining certain illusions, the ego begins losing its old structure. And when that structure dissolves, a completely new space begins to appear, a space where identity no longer needs to be so rigid, where awareness begins observing life with more freedom, where the mind starts resting more deeply. But before that new stability emerges, there is a particular phase of awakening, a phase many people go through, a phase that can feel strange, intense, and sometimes even frightening. It is the phase where the old self begins to die, not physically, but psychologically, the dissolution of the old identity, the disappearance of the mental character that once defined who we believed we were. And that is exactly what we will explore in the next video of this series. In the next episode, we will explore what many call the psychological death that happens during awakening, the moment when the old identity begins disappearing, so a deeper awareness can emerge. If you have already started feeling that parts of your old identity no longer feel as real as they once did, the next video may bring important insight into what you are experiencing. So continue this journey with us. The next video in the series is already waiting for you, and before you leave, write just one word in the comments. A word that represents the phase you are currently living. Maybe it is change, clarity, silence, transformation, or simply awakening. Because sometimes recognizing the process is already part of the transformation. If this video brought insight to you, share it with someone who may also be going through this experience. Sometimes a single conversation can help someone understand something deeply personal. And if you want to continue exploring this journey of awareness, subscribe to the channel, because each video in this series goes deeper into this path. Gratitude for being here. Much light on your path. Quantum silence.